The Fed's latest move, making $200 billion available for easy loans to the financial markets, has juiced the equity markets, as you just saw. Dow is up 349 points. But overall, if you look at this big picture, will it ease the credit crunch or simply fuel the fires that were started by easy money in the very first place that was out there?
I saw Peter Schiff just go, Our Fox panel is back now to talk about it. Just because you were so demonstrative, I'm going to throw that to Gary Kay. Gary?
And what would you like to know?
Is it, first of all, is it good or bad what the Fed did today?
Look, short term, the market's up 350. For everybody, that'll be good. But look, since the Fed started sending the billion dollars into the economy back on September 18th, the S&P's down 15%, gold and oil are up between 30 and 40%, and the dollar's down 12%. So the markets are not happy what he's doing. All these short-term things, terrific for the market for a few days, but long-term, you are sowing the bad seeds of monstrous inflation going forward. And I just think the Fed remains 6 to 9 months behind the curve, and I think they have absolutely no control in the long run, unfortunately.
Terry, today's move, does that trickle out over the long term, or is it just a short-term move?
You know, there's an expression they used to use in Japan, pushing on a string. That's what seems to have been happening, because we've seen a series of these cash infusions, and as Gary said, the market's still down 15%. Inflation is a huge problem. I mean, Peter and I were just talking about the cost of getting a prostitute these days. I mean, look at inflation. I mean, really, this is
on our agenda every week.
Worrying about.
Well, Spitzer was what? It was $4,500 for 2 hours. So. I don't know what it
I think it was
cost.
4, not to be too technical about it. But Peter, go ahead. What are we going to do? The Fed seems determined to continue to do everything it can to, as they say, pump liquidity back into the credit crunch. Is there any chance it'll work?
Well, look, first, how many times have we seen since this crisis began, the Fed comes up with some major announcement of additional inflation, and the market runs up in the open a couple of 100 points. Shorts cover. People think it's a big deal, but look where we are today. You know, all their
300 plus points.
Look where we are today relative to where we were when they started. These rallies fizzle out. All the government is doing, all the Fed is doing, is trying to combat the problems that it created with inflation in the past with new inflation in the future. And it's not going to work. Unfortunately, there's no bubbles left in our economy to inflate.
Victoria Barrett, I got a bad feeling about this $200 billion. I'm sure the banks love it, and it would loosen the tight credit situation at the moment. But I'm looking at the inflation out there, just at the grocery store, everywhere. Everything is more expensive. And could this possibly somehow moderate or temper what we see out there as far as inflation is concerned?
Well, I don't think this is going to impact inflation in a positive sense, if that's what you're asking. It's a steroid shot for the economy. You know, Hank Paulson was out here at Stanford speaking last week, and he said our first priority is moderating the spillover effect. They don't want the housing crisis to affect the general economy. This seems like kind of a measure that would aim to do that. What else can they do? I mean, they're trying creative approaches. You got to give them credit for that.
Well, one thing that they could do, and I don't think they're going to do it because we're in an election year, Peter, and there's no political will to do it, is to try to squeeze inflation out of the system, which would hurt very badly, and at the same time lower the cost of production by lowering tax rates even more.
Well, of course, but you know, how can you stop the housing market implosion from spilling over into the overall economy? I mean, it is the overall economy. The average American has been spending his housing wealth. When that wealth is gone, how can it not impact the economy? When your biggest asset is your biggest liability, and especially when you have all these Americans with arms, and as these mortgage rates are resetting higher, how can your mortgage payment, your biggest monthly expenditure going up by 20%, 50%, not impact the overall economy?
Gary Calhoun?
Peter.
I want to make an important point about this here, which I really do hate, is that the Fed is rewarding and helping out bad behavior. When I see a Carlyle group that had $300 million in equity but margins up to $22 billion, somebody actually lent that money. Both sides of the equation is bad behavior, yet the Fed is trying to bail them out here. I say let them go by the wayside, let them take their losses. Don't be nice to them. I just don't like who they're trying to help here.
Terry, is the Fed bailing out Wall Street at the expense of Main Street?
Yeah, they are right now. I mean, Gary's right. 30-to-1 leverage. I mean, that was supposed to stop after long-term capital. And I'm sure Carlyle's probably one of the more conservative out there, you know. So It's a mess.
Remember, these guys were making a ton of money off that leverage. These hedge funds were leveraging up because they were taking 20% of the profits. So they had a big incentive to gamble with other people's money.
In other words, and when you say that, what you're saying is, in other words, they were borrowing on top of bad debt. And when that bad debt crumbled, so did their borrowing.
And what most hedge funds were doing, they were getting rich not off of good performance, but just off of leveraging up mediocre performance. And while the bets were going their way, they made millions or billions. But now they're blowing up and their shareholders are getting clobbered.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. This is like that poker table at One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Danny DeVito and Jack Nicholson. Nobody knowing how to play the game and everybody giving each other.
Old enough to remember that, Gary. All these youngsters don't remember.
See,
Victoria, I wanted you to go ahead. You wanted to chime in, Victoria. We've been short shrifting you.
Well,
Go ahead.
Peter really creates this doomsday scenario, but for most people, their houses aren't in foreclosure. They don't have subprime loans. What the Fed and Washington in general should do in this situation is try to ease the credit crunch so that regular businesses can still get funds. That's where the real jam can be created, and that will really slow down the economy for a long time.
By
you
creating
cannot
money.
force an ease. You cannot force the ease. The markets have to force the ease over time. If you do
But they're trying to address the issue of fear.
But
they're trying to address the issue of fear here, and I think you got to commend them for that. Look, I agree with lowering rates has been a bad policy, but this seems like a creative attempt to ease the credit squeeze.
You can't ease it. You know what we need? We need more savings. Legitimate credit comes into existence because people don't consume.
Well,
they save money.
I don't think, you've traditionally not seen Americans with a very healthy savings rate. In fact,
that's part of the problem.
Rate.
That's why we're in this mess.
Well,
because we
that's one thing Alan Greenspan used to decry, Terry. He used to say we need a better savings rate.
Have equity in their homes, more equity than they had debt, and they used to put down 20% or more, and that's all gone out the window.
And that went out the window partly because of Alan Greenspan keeping rates down so low for so long.
And encouraging people to take out ATMs
Making easy
when he
exactly
knew he was going to raise rates. So
all right.
Thank you.